Hello, good evening. My name is America Garcia, and from the Reference Guide Showcase, I chose to present my guide about the Second Amendment, its constitutional foundations, and how the Supreme Court has interpreted it over time. I chose this topic because the Second Amendment is one of the shortest parts of the Constitution, but it continues to create major political and legal debates in the United States. The main question I wanted my guide to explore was this: how did a right written in the late 700s become such an important part of modern debates about individual freedom, gun ownership, and public safety? My guide looks at the historical purpose of the Second Amendment. Several major Supreme Court's cases, the debate between gun rights and gun safety, and the connection between the civil liberties and the federalism. Next, in slide 2, it's the overview and main idea. The main takeaway I want my audience to take and understand is that the Second Amendment has not always been interpreted the same way. The text itself has stayed the same, but the Supreme Court interpretation has developed over time. My textbook, We the People: An Introduction to the American Politics by Ginsburg and the other authors, explains how the historical content and surroundings of the Second Amendment and its connection to civil liberties. Chapter 4 explains that the founders were concerned about maintaining state militias and protecting states from the possibility of a standing national army. At the same time, there has been a long debate over whether the Second Amendment protects the individual rights to own firearms or a right connected to organized and malicious service. That this agreement helps explain why the Second Amendment continues to be debated to this day. Moving on to slide 3, visualizing the conflict 18th century text versus the modern debate. One of the visuals in my guide shows the contrast between the historical setting of the Second Amendment and the modern political debate. The Second Amendment was written in a completely different political and technological environment. During the founding period, state militias played an important role in maintaining local order and providing military forces. To date, the debate involves issues such as firearm ownership, self-defense, gun violence, public safety, and government regulation. The important connection here is that America is trying to apply an 18th century constitutional provision to circumstances that look very different from circumstances of the founding back then. My textbook describes the tension as a conflict between individual liberty and government regulation. This was one of the most important ideas I took from the researching of this topic. Moving on to slide 4. The constitutional foundations and original intent. The original purpose of the Second Amendment is important because the amendment begins with the words, "a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state." During the founding period, state-maintained militias served as important military and law enforcement functions. The founders were concerned about the power of a national standing army, especially after the experience of the British rule. This created a constitutional question, which was the right to keep and bear arms connected mainly to militia service, or the amendment protected an individual right to possess firearms? For more than 2 centuries, people debated this question. Another important point for my guide is federalism. Historically, the Second Amendment applied to the federal government, while states had more freedom to create their own firearm regulations. This resulted in different laws from state to state, even before the major Supreme Court cases discussed it later. The Second Amendment was connected to larger questions of how power is divided between the federal government and the states, which would guide us to the slide 5, when it connects to the real-world impact on how tragedies drive the debate. So when it comes to the real world impact, the debate over firearm regulation is not only a constitutional debate, it is also a real world tragedies that have also influenced political discussions. My guide discusses several mass shootings, including the shooting at Robb Elementary, the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. I included these examples because they show my firearm policy, how it becomes such an important political issue after tragedies. People who support stronger gun regulations often argue for measures such as universal background checks, red flag laws, restrictions on certain firearms and magazines. Guns rights advocates focus more heavily on individual rights and liberties and the validity of law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and their families. These 2 perspectives are important because they show why the issue is difficult to resolve politically. Both sides are discussing constitutional rights, but they place different priorities on the liberty and public safety. I'm actually from Texas, and the Uvalde shooting mass was a well-known topic that was talked about for a lot of weeks. So talking about this right now is important to me, right? Because I'm arguing that. So following with slide 6, the individual rights shift, District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008. The first major Supreme Court case in guide is the District of Columbia versus Heller from 2008. This case was important because the Supreme Court recognized the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right to possess a firearm for self-defense in the home. The case involved a Washington, D.C. law that restricted handgun possession and required certain firearms to be kept unloaded and secure. The court's major option, writing by Justice Antonin Scalia, interpreted the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right that was not dependent on service in a state militia. The dissenting justices disagreed with this interpretation. Justice John Paul Stevens argued that the Second Amendment was connected to organized militia service and did not prevent reasonable firearm regulations. Heller was significant because it changed the legal understanding of the Second Amendment. The court did not say every firearm regulation was unconstitutional. Instead, the decision was recognized an individual constitutional right while also acknowledging limits on that right. For slide 7, I added the McDonald versus Chicago, and in this next case, McDonald versus Chicago in 2010, Heller established an individual right, but Heller involved the District of Columbia, which meant that the decision applied to federal jurisdiction. The question is, in McDonald's was whether the Second Amendment also applied state and local governments, and the Supreme Court answered yes. Through the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, the court incorporated the Second Amendment against state and local governments. This is where my guide connects civil liberties and federalism. Federalism involves the division of power between the national government and the states. Before, McDonald stated had greater freedom to establish their own firearm regulation. After McDonald states, a local government had to follow a national constitutional standard regarding the individual right recognized by Miller. In Heller, this showed me how one Supreme Court decision can affect the balance of power between federal government and the states. So that was a great example. For slide 8, I wanted to use another example of Buran and Rahimi, 2022 and 2024. The more recent cases in my guide showed that the Supreme Court's interpretation continued to develop. We're talking about 3 years cases from 3 years ago. So it is a pretty recent cases that I wanted to add to my um, my showcase. In New York, State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin in 2022, the court considered a New York law requiring people to show a special need for self-protection before receiving a permit to carry a concealed firearm in public. The court struck down the law and recognized the Second Amendment right to carry a handgun for self-defense outside the home. Then in the United States, Rahimi in 2024, the court considered whether some subject to be a domestic violence restraining order could be prohibited from possessing firearms. The court ruled 8-1 that the Second Amendment permits temporary firearm restrictions for individuals who have been judicially determined to pose a credible threat to the physical safety of others. I do think that Rahimi especially is important because it demonstrates that constitutional rights have limits. The Second Amendment protects an individual right, but the court also recognizes that the government has authority to restrict firearms possessions in certain circumstances involving a credible threat to other people. For slide 9, it's the Second Amendment in modern American democracy. It's the two sides of democratic, like a democratic debate. My guide also compares the two major perspectives in the political debates. The individual liberty perspective emphasizes on personal freedom, self-defense, autonomy, and limiting government interference. The gun safety perspective emphasizes how public safety, violence and prevention, and government regulation. These different also lead to different policy references. Gun rights advocates often support policies such as expanded concealed carry and stronger protections for law-abiding firearm owners. Gun safety advocates often support policies such as universal background checks, red flag laws, and restrictions on certain firearms or magazines. One thing I learned about comparing these perspectives is that the debate involves more than whether someone supports or opposes guns. The deeper question involves how Americans should balance constitutional liberty with the government's responsibility to protect public safety. Slide 10. My conclusion and reflection and the connection between these topics is how the topics in my guide are connected through the two major concepts, civil liberties and federalism. Civil liberties are important because the Second Amendment is a constitutional protection involving individual rights. Federalism is important because firearm laws have historically differed between states and Supreme Courts. Decisions have changed on how much authority states have to regulate firearms. Heller established the individual right. McDonald applied the right to state and local governments. Bruin expanded the recognized right to carrying firearms outside the home. Rahimi showed that the right still has limits when someone possesses a credible threat to other people. Looking at these cases together, it shows how constitutional interpretation developed through the court system. It also shows how the Supreme Court affects public policy and the relationship between national and state governments. The biggest thing I want my audience to take away from my guide is that the Second Amendment is both a constitutional issue and a political issue. The wording of the amendment has stayed the same, but its legal interpretation has changed significantly. The Supreme Court moved from a long-running debate over militia service and individual ownership towards recognizing an individual right to possess firearms and later to carry them outside the home. At the same time, cases such as Rahimi shows the constitutional rights that are not limited. I chose this topic because I wanted to understand why the Second Amendment continues to be such a major part of American politics. Researching this guide helped me see how historical documents, Supreme Court decisions and federalism, civil liberties, and current political debates all connect to each other. It also showed me While understanding constitutional government requires looking at both the original text and how institutions have interpreted the text over the time. My final takeaway is the Second Amendment debate is ultimately about how a constitutional democracy balances individual rights with public safety. This is the end of my showcase. I want to thank you all for your time, and this last page I want to use it for my conclusion. And thank you.